Okay, welcome back for part 2. As I was explaining before, we're flipping the class. You're taking notes today, and in class you'll have questions. I'll have questions for you, and we'll be able to do an activity to further study evolution. So where we left off before, we're looking at other scientists that were also interested in explaining the new observations that were being made. And so we have one scientist, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and he had several ideas about how evolution occurred. He thought, first of all, that simple organisms could arise from non-living matter, or that living things came from non-living things, and that was totally disregarded pretty much around the same time that other ideas were coming about that made us understand evolution a little bit better. He also believed or came up with an idea that simple life developed into more complex by acquiring traits. And this is really where his idea of evolution, or his way of explaining evolution, comes into play. We call this idea, or at his time a theory, called inherited acquired characteristics. And so we will look further into his theory, which again was not supported by evidence. Basically, he said that organisms were able to acquire traits in their lifetime. And so not only was that crucial to his explanation, he also believed that if an organism acquired a trait during their lifetime, they could actually pass it on. So, for example, I want to, build muscle. I can build muscle in my lifetime, and then, according to his theory, my children will all have that characteristic. I would be able to pass on that musculature to my children. And so, if you can think about how what you know right now may sound like, well, that probably is not supported by evidence. Well, surely enough, his theory was dropped. But we go on to the other side of the theory that we do accept today, the theory of evolution by natural selection, and it's really in two parts. One part is called descent with modification, and the second part is modification by natural selection. And so Darwin's ideas, again, working with other scientists, such as Alfred Wallace, both of them traveled around the world and made numerous observations, but it was Darwin who took all these observations and published a book. And of course, that made him stand out a little bit more. That book had two goals. He basically wanted to show the world the large amount of evidence that there was for his new controversial theory, called the theory of evolution by natural selection. And he also wanted to explain how the variety that he observed around the world, and how those organisms were distributed around the earth, and how he explained that that would be the result of some natural processes, thereby the reason why he has this idea of natural selection in his title of his theory. And so we go on to the first part, descent with modification, and I hope that you notice that we're actually following the different parts of the guided study guide. Okay, if you haven't picked up on that by now, I'm sorry about that. But so descent with modification says that this is the process of how evolution occurs. So this is the area in his theory that says, okay, if you ask yourself how does it happen? Well, the idea is that every species, or he proposed that every species must have descended by reproduction, first of all, so that's number one, that they are descendants from other organisms, and that happens because of reproduction, and that all these organisms that we see today are basically the result of pre-existing species, or one or more. Okay, so this was a crucial part of his theory. And the second part, that this took time, that this didn't happen just in one generation, where I might decide I'm going to develop muscles and suddenly I can have children with all these traits, or this trait that I've developed in my lifetime. Okay? One thing to remember, that Darwin was not the first to propose descent with modification, but he was the first to propose the explanation that organisms, as they reproduce from pre-existing species of maybe one or few in our very distant past. And so the section on natural selection is the theory of the mechanism of how evolution happens in terms of forces in nature that contribute to evolution occurring over time. And so we have 4 parts of Darwin's reasoning that you're going to complete from this moment on by reading pages 300 to 301. And you're going to review figure 15-4 on page 300. And if you look at that right now, you'll see on page 300 that these sections are nicely bolded for you. Okay, so when you're trying to explain over reproduction, there's a little, I'm sorry, it is overproduction, yes. Overproduction, you will have overproduction, read 2 paragraphs, summarize it. You will read genetic variation and summarize it, struggle to survive, summarize it, and differential reproduction. There we go. Okay, so I did that right, reproduction and production. And what's really neat about your book is that they give you a nice diagram with an example. So as you read, please include this example that you have on figure 15-4. Okay, so it says, this diagram represents the process of natural selection explained by Charles Darwin as the mechanism or how evolution occurs. Okay, and so yes, you're going to read, you're going to give you a little definition and example based on this figure. The same thing with genetic variation, struggle to survive, and differential reproduction. So that will be the end of the second part of evolution lecture, and hopefully you will come into class prepared and very excited to do our activity on evolution that will show you a little bit more on the evidence that supports this powerful biological theory. Thank you, and see you in class.